On this episode of the Carolina Sports Guy, we're kind of venturing out, folks, looking a little something different. We're going to talk about this conference realignment with Oklahoma and Texas joining the SEC. What type of impact does the conference realignment have in the future hold on the schools in the Carolinas? Are we going to see some movement? Are we going to see some teams jump conferences? Or is pretty much everybody safe where they're at when it comes to North and South Carolina Division I football schools? Before we get into today's content, folks, make sure you subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. Hit that bell notification to be notified of future videos like this about major college sports in both North and South Carolina, Carolina Panthers, Carolina Hurricanes, and the Charlotte Hornets. Pound that like button, and folks, leave me some comments. I love the dialogue. Okay, folks, other than keeping up with my beloved Panthers in training camp or seeing what the latest news is kind of did, what's going on with the Carolina Hurricanes and free agency, and the Charlotte Hornets kind of wrapping up some last-minute moves they've made in free agency and people coming and going, kind of been following this issue before the college football season starts with the schools in the Carolinas playing Division I football. And this conference realignment thing is very, very intriguing. Now, as you know, most of y'all might know if you haven't been under a rock, Oklahoma and Texas are leaving the Big 12, where they're 10 schools, going to drop them down to 8, and they're joining the SEC. So right now, the SEC is in a powerful driver's seat, folks. Now, you think, does it really affect the Carolina schools, or does it? Because now rumors having it, and this might not come true or not, it makes the most sense to me. But the Big Ten might be making a move. Or they're going to poach a team like Colorado from the Pac-12 because they are an AAU school, and that's what the Big Ten really looks for. The last time they took a school, one of the last few schools they took, of course they took Rutgers in Maryland, was Nebraska. And since Nebraska's lost their AAU status, and they really haven't fared as well on the playing field as they used to in the old Big 12. So where do we stand now? A lot of talk the Big Ten might be looking at Kansas. Now, problem is Kansas football is extremely weak. You'd be bringing Kansas in. Number one, it's an AAU school. Number two, the geography. They're right there with Iowa and Nebraska and Minnesota, and they know that neck of the woods. So they fit right into the Big Ten West. But they're basketball. If Kansas basketball goes to the Big Ten, yeah, it's going to help the Indianas and Michigan and Michigan State and some of the really, really good basketball powerhouses. You're adding a great blue blood program to the Big Ten. But football drives the bus, folks. And Kansas football, if Nebraska was so good with their history, they joined the Big Ten and they're kind of on the weaker side. What do you think it's going to do to Kansas football? So that's one thing to look at. The other thing is if you take Kansas and they become your 15th member, who's number 16? Could affect the ACC. Maybe they try to get Notre Dame in. Notre Dame's kind of sitting back and can do what they want. Does Notre Dame want to stick with the ACC? Do they want to stay independent? That's the real big question. Because after that, folks, if the Big Ten doesn't take a Colorado out of the Pac-12, or they don't decide to dumpster dive, Iowa State's an AAU school. It's in the perfect location. You'd still have the rivalry with Kansas and Nebraska and definitely Iowa. And their football team is better than Kansas. But Iowa State has not been a perennial top 10 team. Like people have noticed, they've had a really good top 10, top 20 team the last few years. But after this year, how far did they go down? And folks, if we look at the history of Iowa State the last 10 years or so, they were pretty bad. And their basketball is just ho-hum. So it's not going to have the same smash that Oklahoma and Texas had going to the SEC. Sure, Kansas would be a win for the Big Ten, but with their football lacking, they need another school. Now, here's where it gets interesting. West Virginia. West Virginia's never fit into the Big 12. And that one conference they fit in would be the ACC. Now, I know the ACC would love to have Notre Dame as a 15th member, a full-time member. It remains to be seen, folks. They could jump ship, go to the Big Ten, or just stay independent. But if you were to bring in this school for 16 basketball and baseball and 15 football, West Virginia makes more sense than anybody else for the ACC. And if that happens, you know, the ACC might be solidified. But a little fly in the ointment is this. There's been rumors talking that both Florida State and Clemson's where we're focusing on because it's an ACC Carolina school. They've reached out to the SEC to form a mega conference. Now, Florida State's been on the downside, but it still would be a major grab for the SEC even though they have Florida. But Clemson would be the one. You'd wrap up both South Carolina and Clemson being in the SEC. It would really put a stranglehold on the ACC because it leaves that gap. Let's just say you had Miami and then you got Georgia Tech. Then there's a gap until you get to the North Carolina. So, that's something. What's the chances of Florida State and Clemson leaving? It's not 100%. It might not even be 50. But where you'd say a couple of years ago that's a 0% or 10% chance, it might be 30, 35 to 40%. I mean, there's a glimmer there. And that's something to look at. Now, with that shakeup, if that would to happen, or even a rumor of it happened, a school like North Carolina, whose football is better than Kansas, and whose basketball is right on par with Kansas, in a higher, more populated region that the Big Ten would covet, the Big Ten would love to have a North Carolina. A North Carolina, Virginia would be 2 AAU schools, and the Big Ten would salivate because you'd have Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. They'd start getting into SEC territory. And I'm not even looking at the SEC, would not even look at North Carolina. But that is something to think about. And if it wouldn't be Virginia, would North Carolina want to take Duke along for the ride to the Big Ten? It could be Kansas, North Carolina. What about Duke? Do you leave them in the cold? If Duke was to go to the Big Ten, their football is just as bad as Kansas, but their basketball is just as good. And prestigious private school, AAU school, it just leaves a lot to be debated, folks. If you took those two out of the ACC, it would really hurt the likes of NC State and Wake Forest, the rivalries, and I definitely don't want that to happen. That is something to look at. Now, also looking is you think, okay, so North Carolina is a Big Ten catch, small SEC. Duke, that Big Ten catch if North Carolina was to go, maybe. Clemson, SEC catch. You're looking at those schools. South Carolina is the one school folks you don't want to worry about. They are already in the SEC. They're not going back to the ACC. They're sitting in the driver's seat. They're not going anywhere. So you can take them off the board. I don't think you have to worry about NC State or Wake Forest leaving the ACC. First of all, if the Big Ten was going to poach a North Carolina school, it would be North Carolina or Duke or nobody. Wake could be a small chance, but I don't think Wake would get in line behind Duke and North Carolina. I don't think those two schools will either be SEC schools as well either. But you never know. And NC State with their football in the SEC, they're kind of moving on up, getting into North Carolina instead of South Carolina. But I really see that just like South Carolina stays pat in the SEC, I think Wake Forest and NC State stand pat in the ACC. So that's Clemson. Do they jump to SEC? They stay in the ACC. That's a big question. University of North Carolina, do they jump to the Big Ten? Small SEC possibility. They stay in the ACC. I'm hoping they stay in the ACC. We have to see. Duke, like I said, same. Do they follow North Carolina if they were to go to the Big Ten? Here's where you start looking at the lower schools. East Carolina would really, in the American Athletic Conference, really, if the Big 12 starts falling apart, there's 8 schools now, and let's just say the Big 10 takes Kansas, so they're down to 7, and the ACC takes West Virginia, so they're down to 6. Let's say the Pac-12 got in this and decided that they wanted to go from 12 to 16. And let's just say they took Baylor, Texas Tech, and TCU. And then you're thinking, wow, well, they're not far from Arizona, who's in the Pac-12. And if they took Oklahoma State would be a pretty good get. You're talking about the second biggest college in Oklahoma. You're talking about Baylor's a private school, and so is TCU. They're Christian schools. But Baylor's athletic programs, they've won a basketball championship, have had good football programs. TCU's had some top 10 football programs. Texas Tech out in Lubbock's kind of out there, but they played well at times. But if you were to take those 3 Texas schools and maybe Oklahoma State, and maybe they kind of break off Colorado and Utah and Arizona State to make that West, where you keep the Oregon State, Washington State, the 4 California schools in the Pac-12 West. It makes sense. Now, if that's the situation, the American Athletic Conference and East Carolina wouldn't have to worry too much, because then you'd only probably be having to worry about a Kansas State and Iowa State. And if Iowa State was to join Kansas in the Big Ten, Kansas State probably would be the only school, and the only chance of Kansas State of getting to a conference is if the Pac-12 and the Big 12 merged, or if Kansas decided to take Kansas State along with them, which to me it doesn't make as much sense as Iowa State because they're not an AAU school. That's their only gamble. So as this conference thing shakes out with 8 schools, if they stay at 8, East Carolina's got to worry about schools like Houston or Memphis or Central Florida, SMU, even Tulsa. They have to worry about some of these schools that are closer to the Big 12 being poached and then leaving the American Athletic Conference with East Carolina in a weaker division. Hell, nobody's even ruled out that if West Virginia went to ACC, if Notre Dame spurns an invite, Cincinnati could be a member of the ACC, could look at it. It's a slight possibility. So there's a lot to look at here. And I think East Carolina's kind of hoping the Big 12 crumbles, and maybe instead of 8 programs, maybe 3 or 4 will be saved, and they're kind of moved along inside the American Athletic Conference, and East Carolina doesn't have to go anywhere. Now, if that does break apart and East Carolina's stuck in this American Athletic Conference with lesser knowns and needing more schools, a school like Charlotte could move up from the Conference USA. That's a possibility. And there's other schools as well. They'd have to be battling schools like Old Dominion, or having to deal with the likes of trying to think of who. Marshall would probably be more in line in Charlotte to move up quicker because they pay their dues. Even Southern Miss. And then you look at the Sun Belt schools: Appalachian State, Coastal Carolina. Appalachian State's been around longer. They won those FCS championships. They still play good top 25 brand of football, but they could be somebody to get into Conference USA if they lose a Marshall or a Southern Miss or UNC Charlotte. They could move up, but they got to look at Troy or Louisiana Lafayette. There's all kinds of scenarios, folks. I think Coastal Carolina is the one that's probably stuck in the Sun Belt right now, but they've been a top 25 program. So the way I'm looking at it, South Carolina standing pat in the SEC. We know UNC's either going to move up to the Big Ten or hopefully they'll stay in the ACC. Clemson, they're either SEC bound or they're going to stay in the ACC. I'm hoping they stay in the ACC. Duke could be tagging along with Carolina in the Big Ten, or they're going to stay in the ACC, which is what I hope. NC State, I think it's safe to say they're stuck in the ACC. It's where they're going to be. Same thing with Wake Forest. East Carolina stuck in the American Athletic, and they're hoping to either merge a few of these members of the Big 12, or that it just stands pat where they're at and they don't lose ground and end up in a weaker conference. American Athletic losing better members. Looking at UNC Charlotte, their chance to move up to the American if a couple of members are poached, but they're probably going to stay in Conference USA. And then, like I said, then if Conference USA gets poached by the American, maybe Appalachian State or Coastal Carolina could be looking up then. But we're talking about way down the road. But it's something to keep an eye on. I thought with this expansion, it's always intriguing, and somehow the shakeup and the fallout always affect other schools, folks. And it's just kind of interesting where we're going to go from here, because I've even heard rumors about Oregon and USC going to the Big Ten, which would really be stupid. But I understand with the prestige and the, it's a power play move. It's becoming more of instead of a regional conferences, they're becoming national conferences. And I hate that because I miss what college sports, college basketball, college football do at the local and regional level, especially if they go back 56 years ago, where programs really were close and small schools and big schools, and it was regional. So, folks, what do you think of today's video? Do you think Clemson's leaving the ACC? Do you think North Carolina might be going to the Big Ten? Do you think any of these other teams have got any jeopardy, like East Carolina, of losing out and being stuck in a lesser conference? Leave me some comments. Give me some dialogue. Hit that bell notification to be notified of future content like in today's video. pound that like button, and by all means, folks, subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. And we will see you on another edition of Carolina Sports Guy.